Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, so we changed from normal. I'm here to ask you a favour today at Prism. We need to raise some money. We don't need a king's ransom. We don't need a salary, a new house in the sunny suburbs of Ayrshire, but we do need a wee bit of help. Often at the request of viewers, we've been filming Prism at live events. We know many of you love the show. The growth in the viewer numbers tells us that. Prism currently has more viewers than the national newspaper has subscribers. It's the most watched Scottish political podcast out there, which is down to you guys. So thanks for that. We really do appreciate it. But in order to do the live shows, we need to borrow equipment from friends and colleagues, and for that we're eternally grateful for their help. However, it means our techies are constantly working with equipment they are unfamiliar with and often unsure how to deal with issues that arise. And from some of our live shows, I'm sure you know that. The solution, of course, to that is to have our own equipment, which enables us to practice, play with settings, etc., to make sure that you get the best experience as well. So any money raised in the first instance will go towards acquiring the necessary hardware. Any extra will be a great help towards our increasing software costs. Just to give you an example, because we now give you more than an hour every Sunday, our costs have doubled. As soon as you go over an hour, the software charges double. And we've just finished paying that. We got a bit of a fright, but it's paid. So if you can help us, no matter how much, how little, how small, it will be greatly appreciated. So if you feel you're able to help, here's how you can do it. Firstly, you go to the YouTube through a Scottish Prism channel, and on the Prism page, there's a picture banner right across the top of the page. On the right-hand side of the banner, there's a small PayPal donation button. Now, that will take you to our donations page. On this page, you can choose how much you want to donate. No amount is too small. No amount's too big. And if all of our subscribers gave us 50 pence or £1, that would probably cover it. You also get to choose whether it's a one-off donation or a regular monthly donation. This is separate from Barhead Boy. I have some really loyal, great subscribers there who give me monthly subscriptions, and for that I am grateful because it keeps the Barhead Boy going. So just go to that page. When you finally choose your payment method, that's it, we're done. You viewers have been exceptional in your support for Through Scottish Prism and its journey to where it is now. With your continued support, we hope to take it further. We have plans, lots of them, starting this Sunday, where we're actually going to do a live show. That should be fun, so strap in for that one. Thanks so much for your backing. It means a lot to me personally and to the team. We all appreciate it. So you're here for a reason. It's to hear the midweek show. Enjoy it, and I'll see you later in the show. Take care. And it's later. Here I am again, but the bad penny I keep turning up. Welcome, and thanks for watching the crowdfunder there. Any help will be appreciated. Today, on big demand, we've been asked to do a program on Freeports, and we're going to do it today. I'd like to start by introducing one of the guests. I was sent an article, a fantastic article, on the Freeport down in Teesside, and it was written by Andy Brown, a Green councillor for the Aire Valley in North Yorkshire. It's a seat he won with 79% of the vote. He's also been a Green parliamentary candidate for Skipton and Ripon in 2015, 2017 and 2019, averaging about 3,000 votes. And I'll put in the description below so you can follow Andy after this. And we're going to discuss his article and the Freeport, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Andy to the show.
Nice to see you.
Andy, thank you very much for taking some time out your busy day to join us. But you're not going to be alone. I'm going to be some company because I don't know enough about this, so I thought I've got to bring in a second expert. So who better, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Baird, our guru when it comes to ports, marine economics and ferries and everything else to do with the sea. Alf, welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism.
Hi, Roddy. Hi, Andy.
It's just, I was thinking, you're a wee bit like buses. We didn't have you for weeks now. Here, 2 weeks in the trot. Great to have you, Alf. Always a pleasure. It is never a chore. And to make up the quartet, who else but our Lloyd Quinan, of the SNP, ex-MSP, broadcaster, weatherman, you name it. As I say, our Lloyd's done it. Welcome, Lloyd. Nice to see you again, my friend. How are you?
I'm great, Roddy. Nice to be here. In good company.
Yeah, absolutely. But I've got these experts, which means that I can just take it easy. I wish I smoked again. I could just sit and have a fag while you're all talking and being experts. So, Andy, if I could start with you, Andy, as I said, I read your article. It was really enlightening, frightening, and obviously you had been motivated to write it. Now, how long has the Freeports been down there on Teesside for a while now?
Well, the whole thing sort of started, I mean, with this concept of devolution to a mayor. And what they seem to do down in England is to start out with a bribe. So they tell you that you can have devolution provided you do what Westminster want.
We know that one.
Will be, terribly unfamiliar to your viewers, I suspect.
Yes.
And basically, people of Teesside were persuaded that if they got a mayor, it would result in money coming into their area and regeneration. So they elected a Conservative mayor called Ben Hutchins by a very small majority. And then he got back in by a very large majority when he started to come up with ideas about how he could develop the port of Teesside and regenerate some neglected land. Which, fair enough. I think we'd all be in favour of seeing a once run-down port cleaned up, turned to good use. The use was good. There were going to be wind farm production facilities there and that sort of stuff. But what's emerged is that because of this idea of turning it into a free port, all those pesky controls that mean that things are done well are pushed aside, and they are in a rush to do it quickly before the Freeport funding runs out. And what the consequence has been is that they dredged the filthy industrial remains from over 100 years of the Industrial Revolution and decided the right thing to do with them was to dump them out at sea, where nobody would notice and it would be fine. The immediate consequence of that was that fish started to die all along the northeast coast, and more particularly crustaceans. So the death wasn't so much of ordinary, your cod, your mackerel, etc. It was of your prawns, of your crabs, of your lobsters, and of starfish, all of which are particularly impacted by a chemical called pyridine. And pyridine was in this industrial waste. So they dumped this stuff carelessly at sea, and then the sea life started dying off. That's before we started hitting problems with the finances. But I'll perhaps pause at that moment for any questions about that environmental disaster first.
Yeah, it's Alf, if I come to you, you're a man who really wants to see ports getting developed. You're a champion of ports. But are you a champion of these free ports?
Well, I think the free ports around the world that I've studied and visited tend to be container transshipment terminals mainly. And I don't think certainly in the Scottish context, the free ports or the green free ports we've got apparently now in the Forth and Cromarty are nothing to do with container transshipment. They're about something completely different. And also the container transshipment free ports tend to be in the port areas, whereas what's happened with these free ports in the UK context is they're much wider geographic areas. So there's something else afoot here that's not necessary. It seems to be quite irregular. I think the fundamental problem as well goes back to port ownership and port privatisation. And I studied that back in the 1990s, early 1990s. And the problem there is the ports were sold off by the Thatcher government initially and that included Tees and Hartlepool Port Authority, which was sold off to, and they ended up in private equity fund ownership, who then sold them on to other groups for a big gain. So what happened there was they bought, the ports were sold relatively cheaply initially, and then used as a big cash and land-based asset to then bring in future income streams, also building on the monopoly power of these port owners, because the port owners also became the regulators. The port authorities were privatised essentially, and that was the same on Clydeport, Forthport, Tayport, and Tees and Hartlepool. There were a few exceptions, such as the Tyne, that managed to avoid privatisation, and Aberdeen. So there were a few exceptions, but most of the ports were sold off. So I think that's one of the fundamental problems is that the ports in the UK are outside community ownership. On the continent, the ports are all publicly owned. They're owned by the cities, the municipalities, the states. So the port mayors, the mayor of the city, has the power over the port already, with central government behind them. And they regulate the port and manage the port estate and plan the future of the port and do everything in line with the requirements of the local community. So this is where we're fundamentally different. We have what my continental academic port colleagues called the Anglo-Saxon model of port privatisation, whereas the continentals have the Latin model. And the Latin model is that the port land is in the public domain, the dominum populi, and that's where it rests and remains because it's of strategic importance and all sorts of other reasons.
Yeah, it is, Lloyd, very much. This is an ideological as opposed to political decision, these folks. And I should say, folks, at this point, I invited Kate Forbes, who is a very strong supporter of these free ports in Scotland, and the Minister, Richard Lockhead. I have to say at this juncture, I didn't even get the courtesy of a get lost, Roddy, we don't like you. I didn't even get a polite refusal. They're not here. But it is an ideological thing, isn't it?
I think, yes, it's becoming clear that that's what's happening. But I think it's maybe an expression of the plan B for Brexit, that this is it's a direct product of our removal from the single market. And in some ways, some of the stuff I've read, perceptive pieces from mainland Europe, kind of point to what they believe is the British attempting to create a kind of alternative port to the ports of mainland Europe and to undercut the European Union. That seems to be the perception. But I think, some of the things that Alf said, are very, very important to us in the context of our free ports is who in the end is in charge. Who will be the regulator? When I looked at the map of the fourth Freeport proposal, you're looking at something that's it's about 38 kilometres wide, takes in both sides of the Firth of Forth, runs from the port of Leith all the way beyond Grangemouth, and bizarrely includes approximately 70% of the city of Edinburgh. Now, that to me is quite extraordinary. The capital city of the country is now effectively 70% of it is going to be contained in a free port where the governance rules, the planning rules, the taxation structures are entirely and completely separate from the nation's capital where our parliament sits. It's extraordinary, Roddy.
So, Andy, going back to your opening comments, who is responsible then? Who is the adjudicator in Teesside?
Well, who's responsible? I would say most of the government is responsible primarily, but the mayor of Teesside is a guy called Hutchins. And what has happened is that the land was acquired in order to do this regeneration, was then transferred to a private company largely. The ownership of it is incredibly opaque. And I'd need to go into most of the programme to explain the complications of the finances. But there are accusations that the land has been transferred into the ownership of a small number of people who are in the private sector at an inappropriate price without appropriate tendering exercises. So normally in the public sector, you would tender something out. and there's accusations that the steel that was on this site, which is very valuable, the scrap metal, value estimated by private eyes around 100 million. It is not clear so far that the public is getting anything approaching even $1 million out of the value of that scrap metal. So putting it bluntly, the public is being ripped off. So the challenge I'm and several other people are making is that fair enough redevelop, because it's the way they do this, the government, is they say, oh, we care about Teesside, we care about your local area, we're the believers in levelling up. Actually, they don't give a damn about the area. They care about Westminster, put the money there. But what they want to do is to be appearing to do things in marginal constituencies where there's a chance of winning votes by sending bungs down to the marginal constituencies rather than systematically finance local government. And that bung is then in the hands of a mayor who's incredibly powerful. The supervision of that mayor is extraordinarily difficult. And he's been able to do backroom deals that are taking ages and ages to unpeel and see what they mean. And if you have similar kinds of things imposed on you in Scotland, it will be horrendous. Because basically, the whole theory here is you can dump pesky regulations and it has no consequences. And we know from Grenfell Tower what happens when you dump pesky regulations. People die.
Yeah, and when you were talking of death, when you were talking there earlier about the crustaceans that were dying, and it was aligned to the pyridine, but didn't the government then say, oh, no, it's just algae that's killing them?
Well, one of the great comedies of all this has been the so-called scientific investigations which have taken place into the cause of this, because they've been desperate for it not to be associated with the Freeport. So they first hired a bunch of experts who said it was down to an algal bloom, which somehow went on into the depths of winter because the crustacean die-off carried on there. And it's completely impossible for a algal bloom on that scale to cause that amount of deaths and for it only to impact on crustaceans rather than on fish primarily. So that was disproved. They then did a second investigation, which said that the theory of the algal bloom was a load of old cobblers. But it said there was probably a new disease that nobody had found. Now, I don't know about anybody else's view of science, but my idea of science is it works on the basis of evidence. You find something and then you try and explain it by also referring to the evidence. Here, what they decided is rather than examine the possibility that it might have been associated with the Freeport thoroughly and with an open mind, they went for the theory that there must have been some kind of disease that nobody had spotted and nobody had yet found. Incredible covering up. And the final piece of covering up is Gove has now appointed an investigation into the finances. An investigation. Normally the Public Audit Office would look at a dubious contracting or whether there was any. In this case, it's an investigation set up by Michael Gove, who's already announced he thinks there isn't anything wrong.
Yes, that's good old Michael. He was the same with most things. And of course, ultimately then, from what you're saying, is that the mayor will either sign off and say, yes, that's correct, it was algae and all this, and he will sign off, and he's not likely to go against anything that Michael Gove says, is he?
Well, I think that in terms of the finances, the Michael Gove investigation is into whether the finances were above board and correct, etc. They will be brilliant people if they can unravel the web that has been spun on what has happened to the public money and the public land on Teesside. It has been an incredibly complicated exercise, and nobody's properly got to the bottom of it.
There's a surprise. Alf, so we don't have mayors looking at this. So that ultimately, who's going to be looking after these three ports in Scotland? Will it be the Scottish Government and the Richard Lochhead, for example, is the present Cabinet Secretary for that? Or will it be the UK Government through the Scottish Office? Who will be the ultimate authority?
Yeah, I think Keith Brown, the former infrastructure minister, asked that question to the British government previously, and I was part of the discussion. Who was responsible for ports in Scotland? And the answer back from Marsham Street, the Department for Transport, was that the Scottish Parliament was responsible for ports. But the reality is they can't do anything about the ports legislation because it's Westminster legislation. So the Ports Privatisation Act of 1991, which was brought forward by Malcolm Rifkin, then Transport Minister under Thatcher, sold the ports, Forth, Clyde and Tay. And since then, the reforms have been UK government acts, and also the Freeports are basically UK legislation. So Scottish Parliament can do nothing about that. The other thing I would say is that our problem isn't so much the dredging issue, it's about planning for new ports. There are no plans for new ports in Scotland. There's never been a plan for new ports since really, for about 50 years, which shows the state of the Scottish economy. It's not developed new seaports for international trade. And one of the proposals that I had suggested was Cockenzie for a European gateway port for Scotland for containers and ferry traffic. And that was to avoid the dredging up to Grangemouth and avoid the dredging up to Leith, because these two ports are basically Victorian infrastructure designed for sailing ships of 100 odd years ago originally and no longer suited. The other proposals at Hunterston and Scapa Flow have natural water depths of more than 25 metres. So for the biggest ships in the world, they don't have any dredging requirements at all. But these proposals are not taken forward. In the case of Hunterston on the Clyde, Clyde port was acquired by Mersey Docks and Harbour Company, part of Peel Group, and they've stopped development on the Clyde and concentrate on development on the Mersey, which required a massive dredging programme funded by George Osborne's Treasury at the time, and also a new container terminal on the Mersey, which was financed by European Investment Bank loans. So Scotland missed out big time on this, even although we had large natural deep water harbours, and the European Commission wanted us to develop, particularly Scapa Flow, for international container transshipment, and also European gateway port for ferry and container services like Cockenzie. So we have a slightly different issue. Our problem is our developments are being constrained. All I would say on green free ports in Scotland is that these installations on the North Sea, particularly at the moment on offshore wind farms, would have happened anyway without green ports or free ports. So I'm wondering, they don't really have that big a connection to this. I think there's a bigger agenda here, and it might be more into the City of London and offshore tax havens, that kind of thing. That's the kind of area we're really into here, rather than ports per se.
Can I ask just there, if Forth is chosen as the free port and we do dredging there, could we have similar problems to Andy down there in Teesside? Is there something that could be dredged up and put out to sea that could affect marine life?
I don't think it's quite the same it's more likely at Grangemouth, where you've got the refineries and the petrochemical complexes and that, whereas Leith, you've not really got that. Teesside, of course, the Tees and Hartlepool was a big petrochemical complex and still is to some extent, I think. But so it's a slightly different thing. But yeah, I think we can largely avoid the dredging. The problem for me is, the issue for me is I don't see the point of these free ports in Scotland, because the wind energy installations were going to go ahead anyway. What is the benefit?
Well, which was the question. Alpha's asked the question I was going to ask you anyway, Lloyd. What is the benefit for us on the free port?
That's what I'm trying to find out. And since we did the programme on the ferries, I've been looking at this because a number of people had contacted me about the free ports, and trying to find out exactly what the benefit is for the people of, the border of the free port. I live within it, so it's ordinary people in the streets, people I meet in the supermarket. We are going to live in a free port area, and I want to have some level of clarity about what that really means. And all I've been able to find out so far is the offers that are being made under the free port structure to bring companies in to effectively remove, as Andy Brown referred to remove all regulations. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, in terms of us and our Scottish Parliament, and as Alf said, the claim that the Scottish Parliament will be responsible, in real terms, the Scottish Parliament is actually going to have to, and will be forced to, put through legislation that will cut its own tax raising powers. Because one of the central kind of tidbits on offer to those coming into the Freeport is the land transfer tax and the building tax, all of which are taxes which are of benefit to us directly because they go to the Scottish Parliament. Now, this is an imposition. So on the one hand, we were given tax raising powers, and on the other hand, we're being forced into using them in a way that we don't really want to do. Same with national insurance. I mean, I meet a lot of people who say, oh, but it's going to create lots and lots of jobs. Now, that may well be the case, but are we in the situation in a country like ours, which is extremely rich in real terms? Do we need cut price jobs? Is it really necessary for us to have jobs at any price? I would also have deep concerns about what's going to operate within the Freeport area. As Alf referred to, the wind generation, that was going to go ahead anyway, and has been going ahead. I see the barges going down the Forth. Now, all of the information on the Freeport's website and of the various partners within it front up with wind turbines, wind. There are mentions of the developments of other types of energy, particularly mentions of hydrogen, but there's no detail in there. No detail whatsoever. And I also think that we have a real concern about the Forth Freeport when you look who the partnership is. Now, it's Babcock's, which is looking after, rusting hulks of nuclear submarines at Rosyth, and is a huge, part of the international arms industry. You have Ineos, the one-man band, Jim Radcliffe, I don't want trade unions, you get in your corner, boy, immediately. Now, let's hope that if he takes over Manchester United, maybe his focus won't quite be as much on Grangemouth, but we've experience of this man, and this man likes to get his own way, and I worry about the diligence and the governance of the Freeports under that circumstance. Then we have the main contributor, the Forth Ports Authority, which is owned wholly and entirely by an offshore investment company, Arcus, and the Canadian government's pension fund. Now, there's a certain irony, I think, in the Canadian government looking to the Firth of Forth as a potential place to develop profit for their pension fund. Do they know something we don't know?
Yeah, well, they possibly do. Like you say, you've been getting contacted, so have I. And someone who contacted me, and I'll just use the initial J, sent me some tremendous stuff. Had done a lot of work, but didn't want to be identified for all sorts of reasons, as you can imagine. But one of the things that was pointed out to me, Andy, by my sources, for example, we promised, I think, something like 55,000 jobs, something ridiculous like that, and it's actually turned out a lot less than that, has it not?
I don't know the numbers on the jobs. So what I do know is that the gap between the promises and the delivery is enormous. And I want to go back to something that Alf said, because it's actually perfectly possible, and he's right, to develop ports well. To take land that's been in a bad state for a very long period of time and to turn it into something that's very promising for the future, if you do it steadily, sensibly, and with a good plan. If you look at what's happened in Hull, for instance, Hull has transformed itself, or is in the process of doing, from what was frankly a very run-down city into one that's now starting to do rather well, on the back of changing its port and building around the offshore wind farm industry, and it's done very well on that. But they haven't rushed it. They've done it, they've done it quickly, at speed, effectively, but with more of the proper controls in place. What's really the risk here is this ideological theory that if you just go for removing controls, everything will be fine. And we know it doesn't work. What's incredible is they don't learn. In 2008, we got the results of Thatcher's removal of regulations on the City of London. They were told they could remove themselves from most controls in order for a big bang and an explosion of the city in London to make huge amounts of money. And the consequence was, for the rest of us, 10 years of grindingly difficult austerity to try and pay for their mistakes, which they never paid for. That banking collapse was caused in the extreme free market, and in markets that were out of control because of a lack of regulation. And now, incredibly, the regulations they put in place in 2009, they're trying to strip those out on the financial system. And I mentioned before Grenville. Grenville, in case people don't know, you can hire your own building regulator in England. They're not appointed by the local authority. You can decide, if you're a developer, who you regulate. You can hire your own regulator of building cladding. So the cladding that was put on those buildings and the method it was done was signed off by people who were paid for by the developer. And are you surprised that people die? And despite all that experience, they have still not fixed the regulation of building control in England to take account of what caused that problem. And this ideology is just transferred over to, we won't say regional development because it's embarrassing to us because we always were opposed to it. We'll just say we're leveling up and we'll decide who gets the bung to do what we want them to do, instead of systematically letting local authorities build their own future and take control of their own destiny. Themes that I think will be pretty true to you.
Yeah, and the other thing I'm hearing, Andy, is that, I mean, I asked you the question, I don't know if you have the answer. Listen, but have wages increased as they promised they would when these free ports came along?
Well,
I'm saying this very much with my tongue in my cheek as I ask you that question.
All I can tell you is that even in the dire economic times of the 1970s, real incomes went up by 2.4%. Real incomes in Britain haven't gone up for over a decade. I wonder why.
Yeah, and I don't think the levies go up in the next decade much either. But the other thing that's unlikely, Alf, in any of these sheep, I mean, I've heard that down, and if I'm wrong, Andy can jump in here and tell me I'm wrong, but it's not actually created new jobs. What it's done is brought jobs from Newcastle and Sunderland. It hasn't really been great at creating lots of new jobs, new startups, new companies, and certainly no research and development. That's likely to be the exact same case in Scotland, is it not?
Yeah, I think Kenny McCaskill's pointed all this out as well in his research, that a lot of the supply chain is already, it's basically imports of the goods, installation in the North Sea, and Scotland's just at the end of that, at the very tail of that supply chain. The additional problem we have is we get no resource from the outputs, as it were, the actual kilowatts that's generated. We get nothing from that either. So there's basically no benefits here for Scotland, either in the supply chain or in the end result to the whole thing. So I think that is a real problem. In that sense, we're just being exploited. But I think the real problem for the ports has been that the initial privatizations back in the early 1990s transferred the regulation of the ports as well to the private sector. So the port authorities were actually dissolved. The other problem, or the other issue that I think needs to be raised, certainly in Scotland, I think more especially, is the right of the government to sell these ports, because they even questioned at the time that the ownership was uncertain of these ports. Malcolm Rifkind actually said that. The ownership was uncertain, and that's why the Treasury only took 50% of the levy that was raised by the port sales, and the other 50% went back to the owners. That just pleased them, of course. So the ports were basically given away, but also the regulation was given away. So the power to tax shipping is now run by, as Lloyd said, offshore private equity groups who made a quick killing, and then no commitment whatsoever to build new infrastructure. There was never a commitment with UK port privatisation for the new successor companies to build new advanced infrastructure that might aid the economy. So what we're left on the fourth is Leith and Grangemouth, basically 19th century a canal port at Grangemouth and an outdated dock complex at Leith. you can tell that by the names of the docks: Victoria Dock, Albert Dock, Imperial Dock. They're just so outdated, it's unreal. And I was actually arguing for a new port for the Forth when I was a shipping clerk back in the 70s with the Leith, Hull and Hamburg Steamship Company. We wanted a new port, and one of the options was Cockenzie, the power station. Once it closed, nearer the open sea, into deep water, you can have your port there, and you're no longer constrained by upriver shallow estuaries that you have to dredge to maintain. But the whole sell-off of ports was unnecessary. It was irregular. It was irrational, and economically it was illogical, because you're handing over regulation to monopoly private equity groups. And I think probably this links to the Brexit thing in the context of these tax havens we see developing. They previously were in the Caribbean. Now they're here. And that's what we're looking at, probably.
Yeah. It's been also sold to us, Lloyd, as it will help us as a building block towards net zero. Well, who's going to police that? And is that just flummery, just dressing? I can't see anything in it that gets us to net zero.
I don't think if you just stick green at the beginning of every single sentence in your prospectus, people are going to be conned by that anymore. It's frightening going through the documents of all the Freeport authorities, and some of the ones that failed to get beyond the first hurdle. The greenwashing is frightening. When you seek detail, there's nothing there other than we're going to build a few wind turbines. But most of those, as Ralph has said, have already been done. I mean, one of my biggest concerns, particularly because this takes in such a large part of where I live and where I've grown up, is how much are we going to be affected by the governance or not the governance requirements of the commercial imperatives of the Freeport, balancing out with the necessary decent governance of our city and our people's lives. Effectively, we've just built a tram system in Edinburgh, which is going to serve the Freeport. Now, at any point, will the Freeport be giving a donation to the cost of that? There are other things which came up at a meeting I was at the other day was they will inherit all the services, the sewers, the gas, the electricity, all of the stuff which has been paid for by us, which they will get full and complete use of, but at a premium for themselves. And I think another thing which has emerged from talking to other people who are political nerds like myself is not too many people trust our current parliament to be able to negotiate with these people. There's promises of it will be green, it will be this, it will be that. And then I look at who they're going to be negotiating with. Now, already we've seen the local authorities completely turned over by Forth Ports, Ineos and Babcock, not just in the context of the Freeports, but in other areas as well. Like when Alf was talking about the potential river services we could have had in the Forth, all that is not going to happen. But the real concern is who in Holyrood is going to properly hold these people to account, when in actual fact, Holyrood is going to be asked to make legislation to give the tax breaks to the Freeport. My concerns about the quality of our politicians in this negotiation. Can we trust the current Scottish government? Can we trust, and I'm sorry to say this, Andy, but our Greens are a wee bit different from yours. Can we trust the Circularity Minister? Can we trust the current cabinet? And these are things that are concerning people. Because if you're going to have a job inside the Freeport, what deregulation of employment law, what deregulation of health and safety, for instance, particularly when you're talking about the development of new concepts of power in terms of hydrogen, what are poor workers going to have to give away to get the benefit of the Freeport? And are we confident in our politicians to be able to negotiate on their behalf?
But another political question, what I fail to understand. I mean, I know the Greens are opposed in Scotland. The Greens are opposed to these free ports, but they will, because of the Butte House Agreement, nod it through. Well, what I don't understand is why the SNP Scottish Government are backing a Tory policy. I mean, as soon as it's got you talk about green, as soon as you put something Tory in front of it, maybe it's me, but I get immediately suspicious. I can't understand why they're backing it. Can you, Lloyd?
Well, I think there's a very interesting story from the early part of the negotiations. Ivan McKee was the lead for our government. And Ivan McKee, as far as I am informed, demanded, or at least asked in a positive, energetic way, for guarantees on certain green issues that were being talked about in these negotiations. And a memo was sent via the civil service, which resulted in Ivan McKee being removed from those negotiations because the other side didn't like what he was doing. And then Kate Forbes took over that negotiation from Ivan, and the whole thing proceeded rapidly without any concerns at all. I see the tail wagging the dog, and we're not even at the stage of putting these things into practice yet.
Andy, this has been a wee bit depressing, this programme. Is there any advantage you can give us and tell us in the Freeports, anything you can find in it that you could say, well, there's this, Roddy, and it's quite good?
Well, I mean, the core idea that you can take a rundown industrial area and transform it by focusing on future technology is absolutely right. I mean, it's a lot of what Alf was asking for to happen in as I understand it, in the ports, etc. Absolutely the right concept, absolutely the right idea, but it's a sales pitch. I mean, it comes back to Lloyd's point about greenwashing. I mean, I've been around the Greens long enough to, at one point we were so small that, if we talk of greenwashing, it was my laundry day, and everybody kind of, dismissed us as being silly. Now, many of the ideas that we were putting forward are treated as mainstream with lip service. But a lot of them are actually accepted as big ticket project ideas, when the things that are actually often the most effective are the small scale things. I mean, one of the reasons people bang on about insulating Britain is because it works quickly. It cuts the standard, it cuts the cost of living, it cuts inflation, it cuts CO2. It does everything you could possibly want it to do on the tin. It just requires a little bit of upfront investment, and it pays back in about 16 months. And so many of the things that we have available to us work in that kind of way. A bit of investment up front, and you can get a fantastic result. But this government's talking a very good game. I'm talking the Westminster government. But what it's delivering, we haven't even got a battery factory in Britain. So our car industry is at risk. Yeah, we are so far behind on so many levels what's happening in China. And I've got all my criticisms of the Chinese regime's unpleasantness, etc. But what they've done is combine the power of the state with the power of private enterprise to get transformation, and it can be made to work. There are cities in China already that are entirely run with electric buses and have phenomenal. There are also cities in China that are filthy with coal and are years behind. But the point I'm making is it can be done if you focus on the right policies. What it can't be done with is if you've got a bunch of cynical politicians whose sole interest is in sending power to their mates, economic development opportunities to their mates, and are, I'm not going to use the word corrupt about the individuals, but the system of the way it functions now has corrupted British politics from a stage when local governments used to be proud things that were in control of their own destiny. They're now hobbled, weak things on the verge of bankruptcy that are grateful for a bung from central government.
Yeah, I'm a great believer that one of the biggest problems, in not just the UK, but the entire Western world, is greed and short-termism, Alf. Because these are all done so quick buck, quick profit, let's do this quick, get some money. As Andy's alluded to, it surely, if we did this properly, you could have a free port with great ferry terminal, for example. If done properly, do you have any confidence that this will be implemented in a manner that we can be proud of?
I think going back to the fundamental problem I see is the fact the ports were sold off initially. All that land and responsibility was sold, and when they're owned by private equity funds, they're highly indebted because the equity fund buys the asset with debt. The asset's inflated price reflects its monopoly power because the government's given it all the regulation power, so it regulates the entire estuary. And it has a local monopoly in all the port facilities there, usually. So it has an inflated price. The equity fund buys that with debt. It dumps it all on the balance sheet, means the port can't invest in new infrastructure. The only way you can get new port infrastructure is if you get government grants. And that's what Clyde Port have done, or Peel Port's done it on the Clyde. And what Forth Ports and Cromarty will do here is they'll get a little bit, I think 30 or 40 million if they become a free port, which is basically the equivalent of what you could build for a Calmac pier. It's not a great deal. So I think the fundamental problem is the ownership model is wrong. It's also highly irregular. But as I said, to start with, the free port or the free trade zone concept related to ports is usually related to a transshipment port, a container port. And that's like Singapore, Dubai, Malta, Freeport, Bahamas. There's a whole range of these. And that's where it works, where you get the goods coming in and then added values added to them in distribution centres or storage, and then they're re-exported. That's not what these free ports in the UK are about. We are not transshipment competitive for the continent. That's maybe what they want to do, but that's not what's happening. Most of the transshipment on the continent happens in Antwerp and Hamburg and Rotterdam. And that's why they are also free ports. It's because they're handling goods that are coming in from Asia but going to Scandinavia, or coming in from America and going to Iberia or Scotland or wherever. We're a transshipment market. So it pays to have a free zone or a free port in a major international hub like Dubai, like Singapore, like Rotterdam, but not in the UK ports that don't have good facilities generally and are not competitive for transshipment. So the whole basis of free ports here is misguided. And in the Scottish context, it's just added in the green aspect because the only two ports that have been selected are heavily involved in offshore wind. But they don't really need the free port status for that.
Roddy, can I just ask off something off? Someone said to me the other night when we were talking about this, Jim Radcliffe's, now this was like worst case scenario, Jim Radcliffe is interested in this on that basis of transshipment that you just discussed. If you effectively bring the crude and the gas from the North Sea into that free port regime in the Firth of Forth, remove it from the British tax, the UK transit taxation system, would that be the principal reason why Ratcliffe and Ineos are particularly dry, or do you think it's possible that in reality what they're hoping for is they can do a deal with the British government whereby they can transship oil without the same level of taxation and regulation that they currently have?
I don't see that as an option, really. The oil and gas, well, the gas that they're bringing in from the States and using it as feedstock at Grangemouth and also a refinery in Norway is happening anyway. Right. And it's not massive volumes. It's relatively modest volumes, I think. It's possible in future you could link into new high volume energy, maybe hydrogen even, that could be re-exported like that. But again, I don't see the great need for a free port for that. Free ports, as I say, are about added value activities, logistics activities related to general cargo, whether it's motorcycles, cars, general products, the retail goods sector, all these things. You get logistic zones in ports, free trade zones. That's the classic free trade area for a port, but focused on transshipment. I don't see it necessarily in the oil sector as being that important. We've exported billions, hundreds of millions of tons of oil. That's another thing that the privatised ports have, certainly on the Forth at Hound Point, that's been a money for old rope, it was described by the city. The tax on tankers. Whereas Orkney and Shetland at least had that tax going into the council because they're still municipal port authorities in the Orkney and Shetland. So the taxes levied on the tankers went into the public coffers, whereas on the Forth, Clyde, and I expect Andy as well on the Tees, all that money just went out into the Macquarie millionaire factory that bought the port.
Andy, you were going to say something.
Yeah, well, I think thanks to Alf's points about privatisation and Lloyd's points about Manchester United, I've got a kind of new visualisation of the way this country works, because it's the glazierisation of the country. I mean, basically, they bought Manchester United using money they didn't have, and then dumped the debt onto Manchester United. And the consequence has been that my brother's a Manchester United fan, and he goes to the stadium and he says it's falling apart and in need of huge investment, and the fans are hugely exploited. If you now visualise that happening to the entire country, with us being exposed to offshore businesses, etc., taking us over, it does feel like the country's been taken over by dodgy business practices. And it stinks.
Yeah, I mean, it's all smoke and mirrors to me. Someone gave me, if you give an example, I mean, we've been in Scotland, we've been promised all these millions of jobs for oil and gas, and I see Keir Starmer's at it again this week. But the one that is, if you go to Nig, and that's one of the places up in Moray they're talking about could be a free port. When you go up there, a lot of them are people who come in, do their job, and then leave again at the weekend and go home. They don't live. They don't donate into the local economy. And I worry that the free ports, Lloyd, could be the exact same, where you'll get people coming from Glasgow, say, into work in the Forth port for the day, and then they'll go back to the west of Scotland, or they'll go down to Newcastle, or go down to Liverpool, or wherever. That won't actually, as we're being sold it, that it's going to create new jobs, new companies, research and development, net zero. I'm just a cynic, maybe, but as we're all highlighting here, it's all about the quick buck.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the big concerns particularly for working folk in Edinburgh is, how do you buy a house in this city? We've got London level house prices in a city where it's been fed from the outside. And what I think is, the talk about the numbers of jobs, it's easy to say that, okay, they're claiming there'll be 30,000 jobs. We'll have to build 20,000 houses to provide for those workers. The reality is we have a massive housing shortage in Edinburgh as it stands. So I think, as you outlined it, Roddy, yes, people will come in and go out. They're going to have to. I can see a situation, again, this was something a friend of mine said to me the other night, it's like we're going to need a dormitory town. And then I think about what's happening in East Lothian, the huge number of houses that are being built right on the edge of Edinburgh, right on the edge of both Mid Lothian, East Lothian, and the Edinburgh city boundary. And you can begin to see, a kind of dormitory urbanisation of the rural land. That's where people are going to have to live if they're going to work in the Freeport. Because a one-bedroom flat in Leith that 15 years ago would have been about £65,000 is now £140,000, £160,000. People on £25,000 a year can't afford that. It's simple. This has got to be, there's something magical going on here. There's some leisure demand going on. There's no question, because I can't see how the infrastructure we currently have can support what is being proposed for the Forth. I really can't.
Well, as I said earlier in the show, and I'll say it again, anything that the Tories bring in and pretends a gift, don't touch with a 10-foot barge pole, as they say. And Andy, I think you would confirm that you haven't been able to give us a real good positive of the Freeport. Yeah, the concept is right, but I suppose I could put an argument to the concept of poll tax was a good idea that everyone who's sharing in a facility should be paying a wee bit of tax. And on paper, that sounds a great idea, but when you actually put it into practice, no, Freeports sound a great idea, but as you've all alluded to, if we don't implement it properly, then it's a disaster just waiting to happen, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I quibble about is the language of Freeport. I mean, I would say redevelopment is a great idea. I think the whole concept of Freeport comes with the whole ideological package, that you sign up to the idea that freedom will give you rapid and good quality economic development. What it's actually produced in Teesside is a mess. It produced an environmental mess that's cost the jobs of the fishing community. It's produced a financial mess which has taken money that could have been used in that community and used its, at the very best, wasted it, and at worst, something considerably more unpleasant. And it's cover for a squalid attempt to buy votes by handing a few bungs back to the local authorities in marginal constituencies that come from stripping funding from local authorities up and down the country.
Yeah, the one other bit of information I got from my source, Alf, was that most of the jobs that have been created, for example, in Teesside, are warehousing type jobs. The quality, the high paid jobs are the out of towners, or as we call them in Spain, domingueros. So the local community think, no, we won the Freeport deal. It's like getting the city of culture. It means nothing. It's all low paid jobs, and it's going to be with no terms and conditions, with all everything stripped out. It's a poison chalice, in my opinion. Would I be wrong?
No, I think you're right there, Roddy. And I think the other point that Lloyd made was very valid about housing, because globally obsolete, outdated ports, then they became obsolete and outdated because ships got too big for them. And that's the problem with Leith and the upriver ports in Glasgow and so on, is that these became very big housing opportunities for local municipalities. And internationally, they were very fortunate because the municipalities owned the harbour. What we did under Thatcherism was sell off the ports to private equity groups, to the banks, the financial engineers. And they were sitting on thousands of hectares of land that could have been developed for housing. So instead of all that pressure we see on the Forth with against the Greenbelt to develop housing areas on the Duke of Buccleuch's land and other land rid about Dalkeith or Preston Pans and that in Wallingford, thousands of houses going down there, East Lothian, that could have been the waterfront revitalisation that we've seen in many cities, from Barcelona to Yokohama to Vancouver and so on. Hundreds of cities around the world have gone through this. Even London Docklands got billions of public money. And London Docklands, I would add, had its Docklands Developments Corporation, which we could have had to some on a small extent in Leith and also Glasgow. That's never really happened in a sensible way. And part of the problem has been selling off the land unnecessarily, instead of just giving it back to the boroughs, the councils that originally invested in it and developed it, and they got nothing for that asset. And instead of that, the private equity groups just sat on it for years. It's not really actually a good place for the Forth to develop offshore wind farms from Leith, because truck access there for freight is terrible. I used to run a container service from there to Rotterdam, and we pulled that and went up to Grangemouth because at least it was on the end of a motorway. But that was worse for the ships because they were having to steam further upriver on a tidal problem. And eventually all that just collapsed. So Leith is not a great opportunity to develop heavy infrastructure anyway. It's not a good, it should be a waterfront redevelopment project. That's what should have happened.
I would say we seem to have.
I think Roddy's frozen.
Yeah, we might have reached the logical conclusion anyway. I think.
Alf, I was going to say, this creation of the Freeport on the Forth, which it looks like it's going to go ahead, that's going to have a real effect on future strategic planning. You know, the government effectively will not, our government will not effectively be able to plan without, you know, speaking to the organ grinder for any kind of development of the ferry routes, the bus routes, any of these things on you know, such a gift that is the Firth of Forth. That's worrying.
Yeah, well, I think of that also in the context of port planning. There's been no port plan in Scotland for a very long time. There's been no ports policy as such. Scotland's been out of the game internationally, and that's part of the reason why we're sitting there with outdated infrastructure, just waiting on any kind of opportunity that happens to come along. But as I say, we're stuck in that private equity model at the moment, the Macquarie's millionaire factory kind of model that always fails because it's got all that debt on the balance sheet and it's got short-term horizon. It can't plan long-term. A private equity fund's long-term horizon might be a couple of years until it needs to sell on to another private equity fund, whereas a port could be a 50-year, 100-year investment. And that's why ports globally are invested in and planned by the national government.
Yep.
Roddy, I'm running out of time. Is it?
Me too. I'm back, and I'm just in time to close it down. If I could just sum up and sum up things for those of you who have got the problem that Lloyd was talking about and not being able to afford a house in Edinburgh. Glasgow's a much nicer place. Move there; it'll be better. Andy, can I thank you very much for your time here, guys? Lloyd and Alf, as always, for your input, and I hope you viewers have enjoyed this every bit as much as I have. Apart from the last few seconds where I lost my internet for a few seconds. I hope it hasn't ruined it too much for you. Probably actually makes it better that you lost me. But until we see you again at the weekend, you and yours, please take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.